Word.
Awesome, terrific. Well, thank you for joining us tonight for our fourth and final session. I want to thank Jonathan and Yoni for continuing to share their knowledge. Oh, excuse me. I think I need to rewind. Excuse me. Good evening, everyone. Judith Sidney, for those of you who do not know me, I'm one of the co-founders of Tribe Talk, where they say rewind. So thanks so much for joining us. Along with the educators and staff, again, I want to just welcome you back for the session 4 of our Israel 101 series. Before we get to the substance of our program, I wanted to share a few details of the origin of this program for those of you who do not recall, or this is your first of the 4 segments. Both GAN and Tribe Talk, a nonprofit founded to empower young people to navigate the complexities of Jewish life in high school and college, were approached to host this important series. This informative program series has been made possible through the incredible generosity and loving memory of Walter and Naomi Chuknin by the Hartman, Koblotsky, and Ente families. We are very grateful for their vision and partnership. A few housekeeping items. Before I turn it over to Jonathan and Yoni, I just want to let you know that we ask that you mute yourselves if you're not speaking or putting your hand up. Please be in speaker mode because then you can see the presentation a little bit more clearly. Our presenters are very excited to see your faces. So if you're eating, drinking, come on, it's all good. We just want to see your beautiful smiles. It's a lot nicer to be able to present to people that they see and know, and you can see by face. Please put any questions into the Q&A. We will be monitoring those during the course of the evening tonight. And I just also want to remind everybody that we are recording and everybody will receive the 4 segments after Thanksgiving. We will be sharing those along with a few other exciting details, which I'll mention when we wrap at the end of the session. Jonathan and Yoni, the Zoom room is all yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Jude. And it's wonderful to be together with everyone this evening for the 4th session. And I want everyone to be thinking actively about the question that brought you tonight, the question that brought you to this 4-part series. As always, we have a lot of material prepared, but it's important to Yoni and to me that we really are responsive to your questions. As Jude said, please put them in the chat at any time. We'll do our best to stop along the way. We really want to be responsive to what brought you here. I'm going to start tonight with a personal story similar to as I did last time. And it's a story about Brandeis University. So before I do, I would be remiss if I did not pay tribute in memory to Vanessa Mark, who may her memory be a blessing, who sadly lost her life in the accident that happened this past Saturday night. All the injured students of Brandeis University. I'm not only an alum my PhD is from Brandeis, I currently teach in the Hornstein program at Brandeis. So that tragedy really hit close to home, people I care about, and I'm really wishing for a full healing. And I want to dedicate my teaching tonight to Vanessa Mark and to her memory, and really hoping for comfort and healing for her family and for the entire Brandeis community. So why do I want to start with Brandeis? I had a unique opportunity this summer. For many years, the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis has hosted university professors around the country to train them how to teach Israel in North American universities in the early years, now universities all around the world. And I was privileged to be invited as the first ever high school educator to participate in this program, in part because also Brandeis knew I would be teaching my current course at the Hornstein program. What was unique about this year's group was that for the first time, there were participants from Morocco, Bahrain, and the UAE, professors from those 3 countries teaching about Israel. Why those 3 countries? Some of this room may have heard about the Abraham Accords, which were signed between Israel and those 3 countries a few years ago. And this cultural exchange between countries was one of the first major initiatives and that Brandeis had the privilege to host and I had the privilege to be a part of. What incredible conversations, and maybe I'll share some more stories at the end. And why I want to start there is because tonight's topic is the Sikha, the conversation. Where are we at this moment right now in 2022? And one of the topics we will discuss is, are the Abraham Accords a turning point in this story? Do they represent a new reality when it comes to thinking about Israel, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israel's role in the region, etc.? So I want to plant that seed, and we'll talk more about the Abraham Accords later. But you'll notice that Yoni and I picked a different image for our cover here. This is a map by an organization called Iramim, the city of all nations, and you see it's a map of Jerusalem. On this map, you will see a color coding of in blue, those are Jewish neighborhoods in Jerusalem, and the ones in the tannish yellow are Palestinian Arab neighborhoods in Jerusalem. And one of the big questions for our story is, what is the future of Jerusalem going to be? In the 1990s, and we'll get to the Oslo Accords in a minute and review a bit what we did last time more in depth. In the 1990s, an idea called the Clinton parameters were put into place, and it's still an idea talked about, which said, how are we going to figure out how to share this city of Jerusalem, or just what the future of the city of Jerusalem should be? And what are the Clinton parameters said? Very simple. The Jewish neighborhood should belong to Israel, and the areas in yellow should belong to a Palestinian community. Well, you don't need to be a geopolitical expert to know how complicated the puzzle pieces, how that all fit together. And it's that complexity which really represents where we are today when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the reality on the ground. So we wanted to start with this map just as a symbol, as a sign of how did this map come to be, which represents a contemporary reality of Jerusalem, but also for our story as a whole. And we may come back to this map at the very end for those who are interested to learn more in detail. What are these neighborhoods? What are some of the possibilities when it comes to Jerusalem? That's part of what we call the Sikha, the conversation, which again, hopefully among the themes that brought you to the class, the questions we want to answer with you tonight. So a quick review of where we've been. We started with Hatikva, the hope, the origins of the Zionist idea with Herzl and Ahad Ha'am, and the Balfour Declaration promise were all part of class 1. Class 2 was Hamatzav, the situation, looking at the Peel Commission, the first idea of a two-state solution, the UN partition in 47, the 1948 War of Israel's independence. And class 3, last time we focused more on the Six-Day War, 67 and its aftermath up to the early 90s. So tonight is the modern conversation, which is really the Oslo years and their aftermath. Is peace still possible is one of the questions we're going to pose, and a lot of people talk about. Is a two-state solution still possible? Is it not in the conversation? What are the other alternatives? What's possible? We're going to lay out a number of models and paradigms, and we really again invite your questions and thoughts and ideas to try to understand where we are today. So as a brief timeline of key events, some of which we looked at last time and some of which we barely scratched the surface. The story of 1967 to 1987, that 20-year period. As a reminder, the Six-Day War in May 67, fears of a second Holocaust, digging of mass graves, Israel surrounded by its enemies. Could this be the end? And yet by June 67, the tremendous optimism that came. Within 6 days, Israel increases its landholdings by 3.5 times, has a new holding in the region. The euphoria of 67, 6 years later, was the tremendous disappointment of the Yom Kippur War. Israel being caught off guard in the early months. Yes, they rallied to a stalemate, but still seen as an intelligence failure. And it's why the Labor government, which dominates Israeli politics from 1948 to 1977, really begins its decline in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. Golda Meir leaving office. Yitzhak Rabin's first term, he'll return for a second one as our protagonist, our main figure tonight. And that revolutionary election of 1977, the first time a Likud from the Israeli political right coming to power. And since 77, it's been more Israel's political right that's been in charge, with Rabin and Barak being a few key exceptions here. But that's very much part of the reality in 2022. And Yoni and I will say a word about the government that's still in formation as we speak. We spoke about the Camp David Accords, Israel making peace with Egypt, who would be the leader of the wars against Israel. And that's been a cold peace, a bumpy peace, but one that's held over these many years and given Israel tremendous stability and the ability to grow, ability for Startup Nation to happen, really important for the history of the region. In the background are really these next 4 items, and then we'll get to the 90s. The Iranian Revolution of 1979. Now, I don't know if there are any soccer fans among us. I can't help but talk about today and then tie it back to this time. Today was the World Cup where England played against the country of Iran. And usually when you sing the national anthem at the beginning of a soccer match, you see the players singing proudly, and you see the fans singing proudly. What happened today, this morning in Qatar, where the national anthem was? Not one player on the national team opened their mouth to sing, and the Iranians booed their own national anthem. So why do I say that? This could be another revolutionary moment in Iran of the younger generation throwing off the current government, which was formed, the idea of that government in 1979, a theocratic, an Islamic regime that has been in power since 1979 that changed the entire region of the Middle East from a secular politics to a more religious politics. And that's very important to understand the region, but also even with Israel, thinking about a group like Hezbollah, tied to Iran since the 1980s in southern Lebanon, thinking about Hamas, which is a religious approach to Palestinian resistance that's different than Fatah, a more secular one. And we may get into more of that as we go along. For the region, the Iran-Iraq War is very important. Again, Iran representing the religious political versus Iraq, the more secular. It kind of shapes that time. The Lebanon War is why the PLO gets banished for a time to Tunisia, then makes a comeback after the First Intifada, which we'll touch on briefly. And that First Intifada, the uprising, represented by this picture here, how most of the international community saw it, that Intifada in 1987, of 20 years of Palestinians who felt in their eyes, under an Israeli military occupation, what would their future be? Why had there been a stalemate in their eyes since the 1980s? And that leads to a political revolution in Israel, which leads to Yitzhak Rabin's election in 1992. So happy, I'm going to go a couple more slides. If you want to go back to this timeline, we can review it in a minute, anything. In the interest of time, I'm going to move forward, and we'll see if there are questions in a moment. So the next slide shows us the Oslo Accords. So I just want to give you a very brief overview of what this map is. And this map represents some of the reality on the ground today. And again, I'll just some broad highlights, a balcony view, if you will. But of course, again, if you have more questions, we can come back to this map as a group. By 1993, the equation had changed for a couple of reasons. The Cold War had ended. The United States and the Soviet Union were on the same side of a war for the first time. So maybe remember the Persian Gulf War of August 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, the US comes to the rescue in the 6-week operation, January to March 1991. How does this fit our story? In the midst of a global alliance to fight against Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait, one key group came to the defense, the support of Saddam Hussein's effort, and that was the PLO, the Palestinians, which proved to be a tremendous political mistake for their political power. When Saddam Hussein loses that war, it's the low point of the Palestinian national movement in the eyes of many, including many in the Arab world. And many think it's that moment that pushes the PLO to go to the negotiating table to think about a two-state solution. And for them, Palestinians thought they were going to the table really to have a two-state solution, something more permanent. For Israelis who had been cautious because of the PLO over time, they saw this as an interim solution. So let me outline what you see on the map here. You notice in the legend areas A, B, and C. A are the dark brown areas, and you'll see them around the major Palestinian cities in Judea and Samaria, as many in Israel would call them, or the West Bank. Look for names like Tulkarem, Jenin, Ramallah, Kalkilia, Bethlehem, Hebron, Jericho, and the Gaza Strip. A were the most populous Palestinian areas, and in those areas, as you see, the legend says full Palestinian control. Not only would there be Palestinian mayors, public officials, but also security forces. A new Palestinian security forces would be established as a result of Oslo. Area B are the surrounding villages of those cities, where there would be Palestinian mayors and public officials, but the Israeli army, Israeli security, would be in charge of them. And the reason for Israel is they wanted a security buffer, a security zone, as they were trying to build trust slowly with a new Palestinian authority established by Oslo. They wanted a buffer just in case acts of terrorism to keep tabs on the security of Israel that might come from the major cities. And that's why B was under the Israeli army. Area C, all the area in white on the West Bank, represents 60% of the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, but that's where every Jewish settlement, every Jewish community in that area is, where Gush Etzion, south of Jerusalem, Ariel, many other places one could mention. And that was entirely, and remains to this day, under both Israeli control of the day-to-day affairs as well as the security affairs. Now, again, quick statistics, which I said briefly last time. A and B, the brown and the yellow, represent 40% of the land of the West Bank, but over 90% of the Palestinian population. So in part, you can think of this in part almost like a divorce, a separation, where Israel is trying to extricate itself, in part, from being active in those highly populous areas. That was the thinking. And the thought was, over time, with trust, perhaps Israel would turn over more of Area B to become Area A, turn more over to the Palestinians. It starts with Jericho, and it goes on to some of these other cities that are in Area A. And what happened was, the early evacuations happened in Area A, and then this map became frozen in time almost to what we see it like today, with the exception of the Gaza disengagement that Yoni will talk about later. But in the West Bank areas, by the mid-90s, it's a real freezing in time of the cities no longer have a major Israeli presence. I mean, yes, there are operations that happen from time to time, but largely under the purview of the Palestinian Authority, the security officials, whereas B does have that Israeli army presence, as well as C does as well. So what this represents as a whole, you see the word solve the conflict, and I'll talk more about that term in a minute, but this idea that is there a way to finally have the two-state solution that we've talked about in this course? The ideas of the Peel Commission, the ideas of the partition. Can we in fact separate into two countries is the theory that Oslo was testing. And that definitely was under tremendous strain after the tragic assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in the 1990s, after Hamas using violence in the mid-1990s and the aftermath of that, along with other tensions that happened by the mid-90s. This formula falls apart over time. We'll talk about when it really falls apart by the year 2000 as a model. But it's this belief in the 90s, the most optimistic period of this time, that perhaps we can create two nations for two peoples. So the map is the promise of that, but also this disappointment of that, because on the ground, it looks a lot like this map says. You know, I'm just going to go to one more map, then we'll pause and take some questions. Yes. So yeah, we can go to the next one, now, please.
Did you want another map or?
No, sorry, this one. No, this I mean, that slide. Sorry, my mistake.
Yep.
Yeah.
No worries.
So we'll look at these pictures, then we'll pause before I go to the Camp David map. So again, this timeline is what I just said, some of it orally. The election of Yitzhak Rabin in 1992 was a game changer, the first labor government in 15 years, this is 1977. The hero of 48, of the Six-Day War, a former prime minister in the 70s, who had said, we're going to break their bones in the Intifada. Well, he realized, like many Israelis, maybe the Intifada is the sign we should go to the negotiating table. And he ran on that pledge. I'm going to go back to negotiations. Again, in the context of the Persian Gulf War, in the context of the end of the Cold War, and the US government under George Herbert Walker Bush, who through the Madrid Conference and other measures wanted to try to make peace possible. Oslo was signed on the map that you saw, but again, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, his inability, since he did not survive, Shimon Peres tried to keep the peace process going forward, but unfortunately you had images like you see in the lower right, suicide bombings on buses and the like, that made it more difficult to move the process forward. A lack of trust on both sides that became very intense. And then Benjamin Netanyahu, who is now about to become, it looks like, the prime minister once again, now the longest serving prime minister. His first time as prime minister was in 1996, in the aftermath of Yitzhak Rabin's assassination. And he ran on a promise of great concern about the Oslo promise. Ran in the tradition of Vladimir Jabotinsky, who we've met. Israel needs to be strong, tough, have an iron wall. And he said, look at the violence we've experienced as a country, including the bus bombing. He did not believe in the Oslo process in the same way. He thought Israel had to think about its security concerns first, and that he put the brakes on. Yes, he was part of the negotiation to leave Hebron in 1998, the Y Accord, but other than that, really slows down the process. And in a moment, I will show you the map of Camp David that's a real turning point. But I've said a lot, spoken more than I usually do. Let me just quickly pause there and see if there are any questions from that overview or from the 90s before we get to the 2000s and the modern period that anybody has. And again, feel free to put them in the chat too, if you don't have them now. Just doing a quick stop. Okay, looks like that. So we'll continue. I'm gonna have one more map before I pass the baton to Yoni, which is the Camp David map of 2000. So this is the very end of Bill Clinton's second term. And remember, Bill Clinton is the one who oversaw the shaking of the hand, September 13th, 1993, that led to the Oslo Accords. He's about to leave office. And Bill Clinton had an aspiration to have peacemaker be part of his resume as he's leaving office. He had negotiated peace in the Northern Ireland conflict, tried to apply similar principles, and even George Mitchell had been involved in both, was involved in this process as well. And he really pushes for this summit. Some would say in retrospect, perhaps the parties weren't ready, but Bill Clinton had a ticking clock. He wanted to make sure before he left office to give it a chance. And so Oslo had stalled, as I described, after the Rabin assassination. Benjamin Netanyahu, who had a different vision, was very suspicious of Oslo. He tries to bring the parties together. And one more key factor here is that Benjamin Netanyahu loses in 1999 to Ehud Barak, another famous general of Israel of the Labor Party. And Ehud Barak said, you know what, I'm going to go for it with you, Bill Clinton. I want to try one more chance at peace. So in the summer of 2000, they tried to recreate the magic of 1978, the same magic and the intensive summit that led to Israel's peace with Egypt. But again, the real difference is that summit in Egypt was years and years and years of negotiations. And here, it felt like a rush process. And so no one was really ready for this negotiation. At the end, I'm going to tell you about a documentary film that you should watch if you're interested in the inside baseball of this, called The Human Factor. I'll say more about it at the very end of class. But let me just for now, I want you to focus your eyes on these two maps. Not every document from those negotiations has been declassified. We mostly rely upon the biographies and the testimonies of those who were in the room. And you can even see from these two maps, two very different characterizations of what was proposed for a two-state solution. A Palestinian one on the left, and you see how it's labeled actual proposal at Camp David. In the lower right, this comes from the AJC, American Jewish Committee. When they say actual, they mean how Israel understood the negotiations to go. And see if you can spot the very subtle differences between those two maps. Yoni, could you zoom in a little bit more, would be possible, on the maps for the group? Thank you, that's great. Notice on the left, the Palestinian map is not contiguous. You can see it's kind of broken into three sections with white security zones, settlement blocks in black. So the Palestinians said, we were never given a contiguous land. Israel was still going to dominate and control us. So say the Palestinian negotiators in the room. On the right, you see the map of it that Israel said, no, we offer them a contiguous land. It looks very different. And you can see carved out in white the major settlement blocks, major Jewish communities. Yes, we want a land swap. We want that to be part of the land of Israel, but the rest would have been a Palestinian state. So from Ehud Barak's perspective, most generous offer ever. From the Palestinians' perspective, you didn't offer what you claim to have offered. Now, there's so much literature, which I won't go into every detail now. I guess I'll just share Bill Clinton's perspective. As the story goes, as Bill Clinton's leaving office, he was speaking with Yasser Arafat. And Yasser Arafat, as they're finishing their work together, and with this negotiations, said, Bill Clinton, you're a great man and a great president. And Bill Clinton said angrily to him, I am not a great man, I am a failure, and you made me one. And what he was saying was, in Bill Clinton's eyes, Arafat was the obstacle to peace. Now, again, there are other people in the room who saw it differently. I'm happy in the Q&A to talk about those different points of view. But that's interesting what the American president had to say. And those stories and those around him are, again, part of this human factor, a document I'll mention later if you're really interested in that story. But after 2000, the question of the past 22 years is this the end? Was this already the end of the two-state solution that will never happen? Or is it just something frozen in time that may happen someday? So again, before I pass the baton to Yoni, I'll just pause one more time. Any questions about this chat, about solve the conflict? Because Yoni's going to take us in a different direction for the early 2000s. Just want to give a chance for questions or comments on what you've seen before we go forward. Okay. Well, again, keep putting in the chat. With that, I'll pass the baton to Yoni to continue our story into the early 2000s.
Great, thank you. In the original iteration of this class, we had lots of reasons why John and I both teach a class. One of the things that we used to do is to each of us at some point during our class would take a position. And so I guess I'll model that just a little bit. John took the Clintonian interpretation of what happened here. I'll step into Arafat's shoes for a second, take his positions on this. So from Arafat's position, he felt, this is again, so much of this has to do with a complete lack of documentation, which I'll get to in a moment. Arafat argued that he didn't really want to go into Camp David, that it was a rush process. He was being set up as a fall guy. Clinton, you are doing this in the last 10 minutes of your presidency. And the fact that you're dragging me into this is only because you want glory, Bill Clinton. When this all goes down, I'm going to be dragged down, says Arafat, with the process. Clinton, you better not. And he says, Clinton promised that whatever happens here, I will not drag you down at the end. And so when Clinton publicly said, Arafat, you're the one who made me a failure, Arafat said, that was a complete abandonment, Bill Clinton, of your promise. And Bill Clinton, what you did to make this a failure was, number one, you did it way too rushed, as John said. And also, nobody was taking notes. through any of this. So we're making claims that this is what the map looked like. Israel is saying this is what the map looked like. Clinton, you're throwing me under the bus, so people are going to believe that this is the map look. But I'm telling you, says Arafat, this is what the map looked like. But Clinton, of course, you didn't take any notes. You didn't have any clear sense of organization at this thing. So of course the thing failed. That's Arafat's position, a model of what our class used to look like. But it is important for everybody to know, and this is, I think, one of the things that John and I really try to emphasize again, is what are the various voices in this conversation, in this sikha? Because we want anybody who goes out into the world and has a conversation about this, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to know what the various sides are, never to be surprised with what the other side has to say. And there is probably no more significant turning point in this debate than Camp David 2000. Whose fault was the failure at Camp David 2000 is a huge part of the debate because of what comes next. And that's what we're going to show you. So what comes next? What comes next is this at the top of the page, the Second Intifada. We today are trying to unpack this most recent election. How have we arrived at a government that is, in many people's eyes, so far right-wing, and I don't say that pejoratively, I say that from a poli-sci perspective, right-wing politically, right-wing on security, right-wing on religion. Where did that start? Many, many observers say that this right here, the Second Intifada, which was born of the failure, they say, of Camp David, was the turning point. Because if you look at Israeli politics in the decade that preceded the Second Intifada of the 1990s, when hope abounded in Israel, when Oslo and Oslo II and that map were really the front and center of the conversation. Meretz, the political party that this time did not make enough votes to get into the parliament, in 1992 when they were founded, had 12 seats in parliament. Nearly as many as the right wing of Ben Gvir has. That's what Meretz had. Labor, flying high. Likud, almost a non-story in the government. How did we shift from Shalom Achshav, from peace now, and those on the left feeling like peace was finally in hand, a deal with the Palestinians was finally near? How did we turn to that? To the results of this election? And of course, prior to that, Netanyahu having the longest term as prime minister in Israeli history. How did that happen? Many people look to the Second Intifada and say, that's the turning point. So we're going to spend some time with that. You'll notice on this timeline, we're not going to go through all of them, though. There are quite a few dates on here that are worthy of really asking deep questions about. For example, what is this Gaza disengagement? How did that happen? Why is Israel now just unilaterally pulling out of parts of land that they had taken in 1967? We'll talk about that. And one that still to this day remains a hot topic of historical conversation is, how did this happen? How did Hamas find itself elected in what is arguably, and people agree, was a fair and free election in Gaza? How did Hamas find itself in power? To this day, Hamas still runs Gaza. So that was obviously a critical moment in history. You have the re-election of Bibi Netanyahu in 2009, who would be prime minister for quite some time after, right down to key moments that we're probably all familiar with from recent days, like in 2017, a US president, after many, many years of in the back rooms, US presidents saying, of course, we think Jerusalem is the capital, but we will never actually openly announce that we're going to move our embassy there. To that actually happening in 2018. The US decided to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Yerushalayim, and all the political implications that involved. And so this timeline is all part of that. And if you're interested later on, want to talk more about some of the key moments here, we're happy to go back. But for now, we're going to focus on this set of events at the top. What, again, most Israelis say, or at least Israelis old enough to remember it, was the turning point in their political understanding of Israel, that second intifada. So, what happened? What is the second intifada? What was happening? So, as John pointed out, in 1999, Ehud Barak took over as prime minister. Bibi Netanyahu had served after defeating Shimon Peres in 1996. Ehud Barak wins the election in 1999. Not surprisingly, for those who are following politics today, Netanyahu loses the election in 99 after there's some interpersonal families, things that were going on that he got in trouble for, family problems that, legally were problematic. That's the best I could say. And in 1999, he loses the election. Ehud Barak, Labor comes back into power again. Elections loom again because, as we know, elections are constantly happening in Israeli politics. And in 2000, late 2000, the fall of 2000, elections loomed again. And in amidst that possible transition of power, the new head of Likud, after Bibi Netanyahu lost the election in 1999, he goes off to make a fortune in the private sector, which he does. And this fellow right here, whose name we have not yet mentioned, but we're going to get to know him pretty well, Ariel Sharon, takes over as the head of Likud. Who is Ariel Sharon? Very quickly. Ariel Sharon was a highly regarded general in the Israeli military who goes back all the way to the 1960s, a hero in the 67 war, and also in many people's eyes, a hero in the 73 war, in the Yom Kippur War. People attribute him with having led Israel to some critical victories in saving Israel in the 1973 war, and then becomes infamous. Well, he was already, for many on the left, infamous because he, all during that time, was a champion of Israeli settlements, and in many ways pushed hardest of all the Israeli leaders for Israeli settlements to take root, and then became extraordinarily controversial in the early 80s when he oversaw the Israeli incursion into Lebanon, as John has alluded to several times, to defeat, kick out the PLO. During that conflict, the Lebanese forces led by Maronite Christians invaded a camp of Palestinians and slaughtered the entire encampment of Palestinians there, while Ariel Sharon watched. He consented to this and watched, and both the international court and Israelis all agreed that Sharon, at the very least, turned his back on this while it happened. And so his name has become attached to this massacre in these two camps of Sabra and Shatila. And in many ways, people thought that Sharon's career at that point was done. But like many in Israeli politics, he rose again, and by the late 1990s had become once again the head of, or not once again, for the first time, the head of Likud after Netanyahu stepped down. Amidst a looming possible shakeup in an election, Ariel Sharon decides to visit the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, the Jews call the Temple Mount, where the original site of the Holy of Holies in the Beit HaMikdash and the temple was, what the Arabs call Haram al-Sharif, one of the holiest sites of Islam, where it is said that Muhammad went up to heaven. Currently, right now, by agreement, is controlled by the Waqf, the Palestinian, the Muslim Waqf, the religious leadership, and generally it is agreed upon that even though, yes, technically under Israeli control, that Israelis will not shake that up too much. And so when the head of Likud decided to pay a visit to the Temple Mount of Haram al-Sharif, it was incredibly controversial. Now, there are those, how exactly it happened, controversy to this day. Did the head of the PLO know, the Palestinian Authority know that he's about to go in? Sharon said yes. They say nope, it was a complete surprise. So exactly what happened there is debated. Also, how much this was known within the Israeli government is also debated. But what he said when he got there is not debated. He said on September 28th, when he arrived, he said, you can see here, the Temple Mount is in our hands. And so for those of you, I don't remember if we talked about this when we talked about our 6-day war class, but when Israel took the old city in the last days of the war, this became in many ways, and for many, many Jews, not just in Israel, but throughout the world, when it was said that when the paratroopers officially took the old city, the words they said was Har Habayit Biadenu in Hebrew. And my father, to this day, you just utter that phrase, he'll start to cry, because for him that was the memory of the 6-day war when Israel reclaimed the old city and stood at the Wailing Wall, at the Temple Wall, and said, "The Temple Mount, Har Habayit Biadenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands." So Sharon very intentionally invoked that 1967 phrase when he said in September of 2000, "The Temple Mount is in our hands," and he said, "will remain in our hands." And that's the key. Is this? He is drawing a direct link between 1967 and 2000. It is the holiest site in Judaism, and it is the right of every Jew to visit the Temple Mount. So he pays that visit and immediately is met with a hail of rocks. And for days after, there are rocks being thrown by Palestinian protesters, rubber bullets being fired by Israeli police, and tension then is mounting. Now, like most major events in history, there's always debate as to whether or not the major event, which is the Second Intifada, which follows immediately after, was caused by this, or if this is just the straw that breaks the camel's back. Because what happens next, I want to focus on the image here for a moment on the right, is massive violence for the next several years. You have suicide bombings like this on a regular basis. You have probably most famously the Park Hotel celebrating Pesach. Pesach Seder was bombed, 30 people killed, seemingly on a daily basis, one bombing after another. You have gunships, Israeli gunships firing into the West Bank. You have Israel dismantling the Palestinian security services. You have retaliations by Palestinians, rockets being fired from the West Bank into Israel. And the level of lethal violence now in the Second Intifada made Israelis look back at the First Intifada and think, what has happened? Because the First Intifada, yes, was violent, yes, was bloody, yes, was lethal, but nothing compared to what the Second Intifada wrought. And it raged for years. And so how this happened and why this happened, was it because of Sharon's visit, or was this something that had been going on for a long time, simmering for a while, is a debate. Many Palestinians argue that in fact, the cause of this violence is not really about Sharon. It is about the failure to really move Oslo. And that map, as John pointed out a couple of times, which froze in 1995, not to move Oslo forward. They say it was about Israelis continuing to build settlements in the West Bank, is what Palestinians say. The economic situation for us, the Palestinians say, is a disaster. Many people actually point to what happened right on the eve of this, something else Ehud Barak did. We talked about the Israeli incursion into Lebanon in the early 80s. Israeli forces actually stayed there up until 1999. And Ehud Barak pulled out under massive pressure, really from Hezbollah in Lebanon. He pulled out troops. And so many people said that Israel pulling out the last troops from southern Lebanon in late 1999 was a capitulation to Hezbollah, and that emboldened Palestinians as well. So there's that. Of course, the Camp David failure as well. And so many people say, don't look to Sharon and Haram al-Sharif to really explain what happened here during the Second Intifada. We're talking about real for many people, disappointment over a failure to really move Oslo forward, and other key elements that we just named as really to blame here. I'm going to pause for a moment. We'll talk about what's going on over here in a few moments. I just want to pause to take any questions from the group before we look at that bulldozer. Okay. So in early 2001, Ariel Sharon, who many people had counted out of politics, is reelected, elected, I should say, as prime minister, reelected. He's elected as prime minister. It was shocking to many. And for many people, in fact, even more shocking than when Begin was elected prime minister in 1977. Begin, who had been the leader of an organization that many people had called terrorist, how could he possibly be prime minister, had been embedded in the government. He was part of the Six-Day War, et cetera, had gone to great lengths to legitimize himself as a politician. Many people said Sharon had not done, he had not wiped the slate clean from Sabra Shatila, et cetera. So the fact that he could be, with all the blood on his hands, elected Israeli prime minister was disturbing. And surprising, but what he ultimately decides to do actually makes his prime ministership one of the most intriguing in Israeli history. Because what ultimately Sharon decides to do is to begin a policy of disengagement. Part one of disengagement begins with what you can see here: the building of a barrier fence. We are now going to completely separate ourselves from the Palestinians. We are going to create separation here. And as the wall is going up, and this wall, by the way, obviously very controversial today. Many people accuse Israel, and we'll talk about why in a few moments, of using the wall as a land grab to take land. The people who were most upset about the wall were actually Israelis on the right, other Likudniks, other revisionists, because what they said is, you are cutting us off from all of that land that we had said was ours. All that West Bank, prior to Jabotinsky, Begin revisionists, are supposed to be ours. You're building a fence that is going to cut us off from that. So really, he is now, Sharon, being attacked much more from his right for doing this than his left. Again, this wall right now, in many ways, is more reviled by the left than the right. We can talk about that, but certainly at the time, he's attacked much more from his right. And we'll talk about that security fence in a bit. Okay. While the security fence is going up, and the Intifada is still raging, again, with rocket fire coming in from the West Bank into Israel, with bombings, suicide bombings happening again on a regular basis, and Israel's gunships firing constantly into the West Bank and effectively destroying Arafat's headquarters in Ramallah, keeping him basically as a prisoner there. George Bush writes a letter to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, and I want to spend a little time reading it. And it's a fascinating letter, and I'd just love to hear your thoughts about what is going on in this letter. So George Bush writes to Ariel Sharon in April of 2004, while the wall is going up and all the Intifada is happening. As part of a final peace settlement, he writes, Israel must have secure and recognized borders, which should emerge from negotiations between the parties in accordance with United Nations Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. In light of new realities on the ground, referring largely to those walls that went up and other settlements that have happened, including already existing major Israeli population centers, it is unrealistic to expect that the outcome of final status negotiations will be a full and complete return to the armistice lines of 1949, and all previous efforts to negotiate a two-state solution have reached the same conclusion. It is realistic to expect that any final status agreement will only be achieved on the basis of mutually agreed changes that reflect these realities. So what is George Bush doing here? And it's a fascinating moment.
I guess from my perspective, it seems like he's saying you're doing this all on your own. There's no negotiation, there's no discussion.
Go on, yeah. No, and you're many people interpret it just that way, that you're on your own. And who is he saying is on their own and that you're going to do this without discussion?
Well, I think he's saying that, you know, in an ideal place, you have to come back to the table to figure things out with the Palestinians, with the, you know, the Arabs, that you can't just unilaterally make this decision.
So it's saying to Sharon, don't unilaterally do this. Are there any particular lines in here that point in that direction?
I mean, I think it several places it said it's unrealistic to expect the outcomes to be the same as what we expected, essentially. But you're only going to achieve this if it's mutually agreed upon.
Mutually agreed. Yep. So that's a big part of this. And Bush repeatedly went back to that and said, I said mutually agreed. Any parts of this that actually say, Sharon, keep doing what you're doing, building this wall?
Nope.
Critics of Bush said, in fact, that that's actually what he was doing, because yes, ultimately, and again, I'm not taking a position on this, I'm saying how they interpret it, and this is one of the most controversial letters for the following reason, is that yes, ultimately, there will have to be a mutually agreed upon change, but ultimately, those can be deferred until Israel creates as many new realities on the ground as they want. In other words, Sharon, keep building that wall. And then ultimately, yes, we will mutually agree, but if you can create a fait accompli enough that those mutually agreed changes will just they'll have no choice. So it is extremely complicated what's going on here, and people on both sides read it that way. And that in many ways is what's going on here in 2004. And people in fact say that this is actually not helping with the Intifada, that it's actually making it worse because people are now interpreting America as speaking out of both sides of its mouth. Whether it was choosing to or not, this statement in many ways fed that narrative. What Sharon decides to do next, or at least at this time, is to call it quits on Gaza. Gaza has been nothing but heartache. In fact, Gaza going all the way back to the late 70s, when Israel was trying to make a peace agreement, we talked about this last class, was trying to make a peace agreement with Egypt. And you'll remember Egypt came into its peace negotiations with Israel saying, we will not make a peace agreement alone with you. You must include a deal with the Palestinians too. That will be part of our agreement. And when that proved impossible, they struck that from the table. But Egypt said, okay, fine, we're not going to make a full agreement with the Palestinians, okay, but at the very least, Israel, we have to deal with Gaza. So you're going to keep Gaza, and you're going to work through an agreement on what happens with Gaza. And Israel said, no, you're going to take Gaza and Egypt. And Egypt said, if you force Gaza on us, the deal is off the table. So nobody wanted to touch Gaza. And so Gaza remained as part of Israeli controlled by the Defense Department land up until this moment when Sharon said enough is enough. Now, what makes this particularly complicated, as I said before, Sharon was the darling of the settlements. It was Sharon who led the charge to putting settlements into the Sinai that were then dismantled with the peace agreement. It was also Sharon that led the charge into putting settlements all throughout Gaza. 21 of them, in fact, including this big one, Gush Katif. These were Sharon's babies. So Sharon, in February of 2004, as part of the disengagement plan, says we're done. no more Gaza. And for all the rage that the right and the Likud had at him for putting up a wall and separating Israel from their rightful land in the West Bank, when he made that announcement, apoplectic. So here, just wanted to look, before we continue on with our story about Gaza, is ultimately where all those walls we were talking about have landed today. And so, as you can see, they do go in and out of the West Bank, and also barrier fences within Jerusalem. And one of the major discussion points of Oslo was going to be that we will reach a final status on what the Jerusalem situation will be. And many people have said that these fences around Jerusalem have made it much more difficult to create a resolution. Oops, jumping on me. As many people have said, the wall put up by Sharon has made things more difficult as well, particularly because it's about 10%-ish of the West Bank that had originally been on the other side of the wall is now, 10% is now on the Israeli side of the wall. So disengagement, again, two parts, includes the wall or security fence, depending where it is. Some places the wall, some places the fence. John can talk about that. I'll let John talk about his own conversations with people about wall versus fence in a few moments. But this, we'll just call it barrier, is throughout the West Bank and Israeli border, and also throughout Jerusalem as well. Okay, taking us forward again, we'll come back to the Gaza story in a few moments. Major development happens in January of 2005. Yasser Arafat, or actually we'll probably go back a month earlier, 2 months earlier, on November 11th, 2004, Yasser Arafat unexpectedly dies. And that leaves a major vacuum in Palestinian leadership. And Mahmoud Abbas takes over as the president of the Palestinian Authority. This picture, just want to unpack this, is in many ways so symbolic of that moment. The towering figure of Yasser Arafat, wearing the keffiyeh, the famous keffiyeh, in his army uniform, unshaven, which was always part of the look, intentionally so, with the very Western, wearing a suit, yes, wearing the keffiyeh, but not on his head. It's around his neck, much more symbolically, overshadowed. And many people wondered in that moment, would Mahmoud Abbas really be able to pick up and take the mantle of Arafat's leadership? And though he is still the president to this day, there are many people who say that his very weak state, really only controlling a very weakened West Bank and not at all Gaza, which we'll talk about in a moment, began in this moment and has continued to this day. People in many ways throw George Bush into the, or under the bus maybe for this a little bit, for his beginning moments with Abbas, where he says, oh, Abbas is the first president to visit the White House, and Palestinian president for 5 years. And Bush says to him, we will stand with you, Mr. President, as you combat corruption, reform the Palestinian security services, and reform your justice system, and revive your economy. Oh, good, says Mahmoud Abbas. That's all I have to do to get you to stand with me, is those minor things? So many people say, had George Bush been maybe a little bit more patient, maybe at the outset with Abbas, things might have been different. Many people say that was never going to happen, and what has happened with Abbas and his weakness has nothing really to do with any American president. Okay. So to summarize, and again, we'll come back to Gaza in a few moments. We'll come back to Abbas and to Arafat in a moment, but I want to just finally put just a summarizer on what happened with the Second Intifada and why it was so important for for Israelis and also for Palestinians. Over 1,000 Israelis are killed. 2,700 Palestinians are killed. Depending whose count, Palestinians say 2,700, the Shin Bet has it closer to 2,100. 466 from Hamas, 408 from Fatah, 205 from a brand new organization called Islamic Jihad. We'll talk about that in a moment. 334 Palestinian security forces are killed. And we still to this day debate how many Palestinians were killed were combatants versus civilians. We just don't know. These are unfathomable numbers. And so it's not hard just by looking at that and the images we were looking at before to understand why this was a break for both Israelis and Palestinians from the vision of peace that had existed in the 1990s. And for people like Ariel Sharon, who had believed that the future of Israel was through settlements and through Israeli expansion, Israeli contraction for him seemed to be the future. And indeed, in August of 2005, he followed through on what he had promised. People weren't sure if he would, but he did. And each of those 21 settlements, with the person who had put them there to begin with, overseeing the evacuation, were brought to an end. And you can see it was not for the Israelis peaceful. The army had to fight their way through, had to drag them out. And the Likud turned their back on Sharon. They said, we are done with you. This is not what the Likud stands for. This is not Jabotinsky's vision. And Ariel Sharon said, fine, that's okay, because Israel is with me. And he quits and founds a new party called Kadima. As you can see right here, Kadima. And Kadima, interestingly, means onwards. It also is what Israeli commanders in Tzahal, in the army, say to their brigades when they're about to go into battle. They say, "Follow me, Kadima," which is also part of the Israeli ethos in the army, is that that Israeli leadership doesn't stand back and watch. They go into battle. So Kadima, together we will go forward, which has both togetherness and a militaristic feel to it as well. And they go into brand new elections expected to be held in 2006. And Kadima is overwhelmingly the favorite to win. Likud is now backseated. People are predicting that Sharon's idea of contraction and managing the conflict this way is ultimately going to be the path forward for Israel. And on January 4th of 2006, after quite some time of Sharon's doctors telling him to lose weight, he has a stroke and he doesn't recover from it. And in much of the same way that we saw in the previous image, Abbas being overshadowed by Arafat, the new Kadima head, Ehud Olmert, is overshadowed by Sharon. He did not have the same gravitas. He had actually quite a bit of controversy in his background. And yes, even though Olmert wins the election, he is not in a strong position at all as the new head of Kadima, as the new prime minister. And in that context, a year later, there are elections held in the Gaza that had been left behind by the Kadima government. And in those elections, Hamas wins. Hamas, as John just to remind everybody, Hamas was a political party founded in 1987 on the eve of the First Intifada, largely inspired by Iran and by the awakening of Islamist politics that have long been secular in the Islamist world. It's hard for us to imagine that because we imagine Arab politics being so right-wing, so Islamist. That's really a development of the late 70s and 1980s, and Hamas comes to power, comes to its own self in the 1980s in that context. And in many ways, 20 years later, they have reached the fruition of their power by when they take over the Hamas government. How exactly that happened, what that meant, is an enormous debate. But I'll leave you with one final thought before we turn the next part of the story over to John. So within the Palestinian political ranks, the rise of Hamas is actually interpreted in the following way. The unilateral Israeli withdrawal caused a lot of damage to the Palestinian Authority. So as much as it was heralded on the left and people saying, thank you for doing this, Sharon, you are now the darling of the left, it actually was more harmful than you realize. For more than a decade, the Palestinian Authority invested in negotiations with Israel. And then when Israel finally withdrew from Gaza, it did so without any kind of negotiations. So obviously, Hamas took credit for the whole thing. They told people to look with their own eyes. Abu Mazen, that's Mahmoud Abbas's Namdagar. Abu Mazen's way of negotiations could barely make the Israelis move a few inches, and yet the armed struggle, the Intifada, the Second Intifada, the bus bombings, all those things caused Israel to run away from Gaza. They presented it as a victory over Sharon, but it was most of all a victory over Mahmoud Abbas for them. And so this is a really complicated story. How Hamas comes to power, what happened in Gaza, what the impact of the Second Intifada was, etc., are all things we are debating to this day. And that in many ways is the next part of our story. And John, I believe, is frozen. You there? No, we've lost him. Okay. So as John, hold on for 1 second. You know, before we actually pick this up and while we await John, actually, that was a mouthful. Are there questions about that piece of history that we would turn over? The Second Intifada, the disengagement, the wall, rise of Hamas, any of those things? Questions from the group about that?
Tony, I would just make the comment, isn't it the case that the building of the wall greatly reduced the terrorist activity against the Israelis?
Yep, it absolutely has. I think there is no doubt about that. And in fact, there are many people who argue that ultimately that is the most important thing. And that if the wall, even if for many Israelis who say, we're not so comfortable with it, we don't love the idea of taking land that we unilaterally and rather than through mutual agreement took, if the wall is going to protect our lives, that is the most important thing. So yeah, that has happened, and that is certainly one interpretation of the wall. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yes. So Elisa asked the question, can I please speak to how the Second Intifada caused a shift in the Israeli electorate? And that actually is really going to be the story of what we look at next. And so that's the next part of our story. So I want to see if John is coming back on before I dive into his part, and I will do that. So Elisa, thank you for that question. Let's take a look at what where this leaves us. So okay. So political scientists trying to make sense of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have framed the conflict, or those who have really thought about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of three different ways. There are those, there are Israeli leaders who have sought to solve the conflict. and that would be the Rabins of the world, Rabin, Perez, Ehud Barak, that we can come to a final status agreement, creating a two-state solution. There are those who believe that we can manage the conflict, that we can't necessarily solve the conflict, but we can manage it, and certainly Sharon falls into that category, that we don't know what Palestinians are ultimately going to do, but we can manage it by putting up walls, by disengaging, even if it has to be unilaterally, etc. Sometimes by fighting militarily, we can manage the conflict. And there are those who have argued that we can actually shrink the conflict. And I'm going to hold off on explaining what that is in a moment, because we'll get to that. That was the most recent Israeli government argued that shrinking the conflict is ultimately the way to go. And so I'll hold off and tell you about what that looks like in a moment. So we'll come back to the book Catch 67. This is certainly what a shrink the conflict looks like, and we will return to them momentarily. So just to quickly review, solving the conflict looks like Oslo. We can create a two-state solution. It's complicated. We're all nested within each other inside the West Bank, but ultimately we can figure this out. Of course, to this day, and this, Elisa, comes to your question, by 2004, when Sharon announces that we're pulling out of Gaza and the wall is going up, most Israelis had come to believe that solve the conflict was just not possible. It's just not on the table. And so this is really for those who believe that it is or should still be what we talk about, have really tried to continue to assert what that could look like. And so there are organizations still fighting for that. And so I would certainly urge you to, you have the link in the handout, to go into websites like this one, is Peace Still Possible, to look at some of the suggestions about whether or not solve the conflict is still possible. Manage the conflict was really what became Israeli political, and in many ways to this day, how many Israelis see the way the conflict ought to be waged or ought to be approached. Certainly Bibi saw it that way, sees it that way, Sharon saw it that way, and in many ways, as John alluded to earlier, the Abraham Accords were an attempt to manage the conflict. So what does that mean? What does it mean to manage the conflict? It means a lot of different things. It means putting up the security barrier. It meant disengaging unilaterally. It also meant thinking about the Israeli-Arab conflict, meaning with other states, from a very different perspective. You know what? We can actually solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by reaching far, far out. And it's called in the political science world the outer ring strategy. So what does that mean? What is the outer ring strategy? The outer ring strategy goes something like this. The Palestinians have to be forced to the negotiating table. They were forced to the negotiating table in 1993 when they were defeated, chose the wrong side in the first Gulf War by taking Saddam Hussein's side. And so history has shown the Palestinians can be forced to the negotiating table, but Israel is never going to do it. If the Palestinians are isolated the way they were in 1993, because they were the only Arab organization to support Saddam Hussein, all the others had rallied against Saddam Hussein. If we can isolate the Palestinians, they'll be forced back to the negotiating table again. And so the outer ring strategy is that if we can get other Arab states to make peace with us, and then put pressure on the Palestinians to make peace with Israel, so the pressure doesn't come from us, it comes from the Arab states, we will then ultimately get the Palestinians to make peace with us. So the big dogs in this fight, really, or the big dog in this fight, is actually right here, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Can we get Saudi Arabia to make peace with us? And that really has been, for the Israeli government for quite some time, and certainly under the Netanyahu government, really their focus. Now, they knew that they couldn't get Saudi Arabia immediately, but if they could get Saudi-controlled or Saudi-friendly states to make peace first, then perhaps Saudi Arabia would be willing to go next. So let's do some test cases, and perhaps then we'll be able to get Saudi Arabia to come, depending on how it goes. So with the UAE making peace, with Morocco making peace, with Sudan making peace, that would be ultimately the way we would get Saudi Arabia to join. And so those are all part of the Abraham Accords. And so that's all part of the manage the conflict view, that we can manage conflict by forcing the Palestinians to the table via Saudi Arabia and the other outer ring states. I see John is back. John, I don't know if you want to add to that, but this is your story that I'm paying you back for your picking me up last week.
Exactly. We all have our technical snafus from time to time. Thank you for that. Yeah, so I want to respond directly to Jude's good question in the chat. How has the Arab Accords played into the outer ring strategy at this point? It's early days. So the Accords since 2020, but we have these three countries of Bahrain, the UAE, and Morocco as test cases. I told you my story about cultural exchange, and certainly there's still ongoing thought about what would come of a nuclear Iran. All these states aligned with Saudi Arabia don't want Iran to be nuclear for their own purposes. It's not just Israel, the US, they're interested as well. So on the one hand, I think you see some warming of ties, definitely culturally, slightly diplomatically, exchange of ambassadors, economically, a lot of Israelis have gone to Dubai, and even the country of Qatar. Maybe you can zoom in where Qatar is near Bahrain on the map. So right just below Iran, you can see where Qatar is. That's where the World Cup is going on right now. And 1,000 Israelis took a plane to Qatar, of all places. Not one of the countries, but that's an interesting just other moment. Never happened in history. So does this all symbolize, again, a warming of relations? Because the sense is the main proxy war of the Middle East. People used to say the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the center of everything. Now the general consensus is no, 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 and has not been for some time. The core conflict has been Saudi Arabia and Iran, these two poles. So overall, the sense is, well, this is strengthened. The outer ring strategy has worked. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu would take credit for that. He's claimed this will be true for years. And I am sure he will trump it and talk about it again as he's about to form a new government and say, look, my approach worked. And I'm sure he's going to work very, very hard to achieve what Yoni referenced, the ultimate prize, even if it's not full normalization with Saudi Arabia, moving ever closer. And some may have heard a quote from our former president, Donald Trump, speaking at the Republican Jewish Coalition, where he said, had I been elected in 2020, that would have happened. You can agree or that he may be right or not, but it's interesting that that's a statement he chose to make, which again, I think symbolizes the strategy that was at hand as these accords were being signed.
And by the way, the only thing I would add to that, I was just throw in there, is that there actually has been movement in terms of normalization, maybe too strong a word, but certainly Israel now having air rights, flyover rights over Saudi Arabia is an important step in that direction, because that it's hard to imagine Israel with all this landmass was legally not allowed to fly over Saudi Arabia. So that is a fairly big deal. All right. Shall we move forward?
Let's do that. Right, so I'll say very briefly here. So the Abraham Accords actually led to a summit between all of the parties who met together. And this happened under the outgoing now Prime Minister Yair Lapid, when he was the foreign minister, all met in the Negev and symbolically came to the Negev, a desert area which resembles the other countries. And I just wanted to read this quote because it shows an interesting tie between the Abraham Accords and albeit tied to the Camp David Accords between Egypt in earlier times. The UAE foreign minister said when all these countries met, Morocco, Bahrain, UAE, Egypt, Israel, and Jordan meeting together, he said, Egypt showed us leadership 43 years ago, referencing Camp David in legitimizing Israel. In Israel, he stressed that it's been part of this region for a very long time. We lost those 43 years, he said, looking at Egyptian foreign minister Shukri. Now we are just trying to follow your footsteps. An incredibly powerful statement, because when Egypt made peace with Israel, it was ostracized. It was the black sheep of the entire region. It was seen as a terrible mistake. How could you break the pact of normalizing Israel before we solve the Palestinian issue? How could you do that? Such anger. And now, how the tides have turned. No, sorry, Egypt, we're the ones who blew it here. We should have been following your page decades ago. Just symbolizes, I think, the optimism that some have about this strategy being successful going forward. Go to the next slide. And so again, you see here's a famous handshake from the all being together, that Negev Summit. And it's about regional forum and such. And it's about combating Iran. And the idea is that this will help to combat Iran. What it means for the Palestinian question, I think, I'll just leave this as an open question and pass it back to Yoni. Will these ties mean anything for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? So for example, let's say, Yair Lapid said before the UN, I want to go back to that two-state solution that solved the conflict approach. He used that, I think, both as a belief and a campaign strategy. Well, he lost the election. Prime Minister Netanyahu won. So let's say we're going back to a manage the conflict strategy. Will these countries who now have relations with Israel say, okay, that's your business? Or say, no, we have peace with you now. We now have leverage. Sorry, you can't go back to a manage the conflict. You have to continue to negotiate and try to solve. I'll just leave that as an open question. That's something we're all going to be watching in the coming years. How does this dynamic change, if at all, the dynamics around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
All right, so let's talk about what this concept of shrink the conflict means. The most recent government is probably going to be the one most credited with really trying to do that, as John alluded to, that the government now is likely to go back to manage the conflict. So what was he talking about going back to? Because this most recent government was really focused on shrinking the conflict. So as probably know, when Netanyahu was forced out of government going back a few years ago, and then there was a series of elections, most people said that really the two camps in Israeli politics, you're either voting for Netanyahu or against Netanyahu. That's really ultimately who you were going to vote for and what kind of government you're going to get. But it turns out that the anti-Netanyahu camp that took power in 2021 actually had a political vision. It wasn't just anti-Netanyahu, because the leader of that government, at least the first prime minister of that government, Naftali Bennett, had long talked about shrinking the conflict. And one of the most prominent players he brought in to ensure that they would have a majority in the Knesset, meaning a functioning government, this fellow right here, Mansour Abbas, not to be because of Mahmoud, Mansour Abbas, the head of the Ram Arab Party, was also focused on shrinking the conflict. So this is notable for a whole lot of reasons. This fellow right here, this is the first time that Israeli political, an Arab political party is brought into the government. And without getting into a whole lot of detail, I want to focus on what he tried to accomplish in Mansour Abbas in the government. Rather than focus on solving the conflict, on pushing forward big Palestinian issues, Mansour Abbas said, no, you know what? We're actually going to try to make life just better. Make life better for Israeli Arabs in particular. So shrink the conflict. Rather than rather than try to solve the thing, let's try to take some of the pain points away. Let's try to make life better. And so one of the ways he did that was he became one of the key instruments in passing the budget. So just to give you 5 seconds of background on that, the Israeli government is required to pass a budget, and if it doesn't, it will collapse, and you have to call new elections. And so people were thinking, "Oh my God, there's Naftali Bennett, this anti-Netanyahu government led by Bennett is going to collapse because they can't pass a budget." But Abbas comes in with a few others and saves the day and says, "Great, I will help pass the budget if you give us a few things." And he doesn't ask for the moon; he asks for just a few key things. We're going to ask for money for development of, and you can see here just a few key elements like, so let's move this out of the way because I can't read because there's oops, sorry. The full screen is blocked. There we go. That out of the budget, we will get $1.4 billion for the professions to develop our Arab economy, teach us Hebrew better, encourage qualitative integration in the employment market. We need better daycare. We need to allow Arab women into the employment. We need better technological innovation, high tech, health services, etc. So let's talk about the ways in which Arab Israelis experience life less than positively and solve those. Let's shrink the conflict, he said. Let's recognize Bedouin villages that you have not recognized, Israeli government, so they can be put on the grid and get electricity and get sewage systems and get garbage pickup. So let's see if we can shrink the pain points along the conflict and see if we can start moving us in a positive direction. That way, that is the vision of shrink the conflict. Prime Minister Bennett was also a proponent of that. And in November of 2022, just a few weeks ago, that vision lost. And it lost, as you can see here, to the far right. And John and I are going to talk for a few minutes now moving forward. So for our last piece together, just to think a little bit about what are the through lines, because many, many people on this call, as is the Jewish community throughout the world, has been trying to figure out what just happened. So as you can see here, the big winners in this most recent election were Netanyahu in the Likud, the religious Zionists on the far right, as along with Shas, an ultra-Orthodox Sephardi party, and the United Torah Judaism party, an ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi party. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rest are out. What does this mean? What does this mean? What does that do with the class we've been looking at? What does that have to do with recent political developments, long history? We're going to look at that for a few moments now. One thing we want to caution everybody in thinking about is this is a blowout for the right. Because yes, while they do have 64 seats in the government, and that is quite a bit, is it 64, 65? I'm not sure exactly, John, what the final tally is.
64.
64. That's quite a bit. The actual numbers separating the two blocks, the pro-Netanyahu, that very right-wing bloc, and the anti-Netanyahu, which includes a lot of right-wing voters, to be sure, but the more moderate left and even left-wing bloc is somewhere between 25 and 30,000 votes. That's not a lot at all. Roughly 49% of Israelis voted for the Netanyahu bloc. Roughly 49%, a little less, 48.8, 48.9% voted for the anti-Netanyahu bloc, and the rest voted for small parties that didn't make it. So we're not talking about a whole lot of difference. But as you can see here from a poll done in August of 2022, those who affiliate themselves, self-identify with being on the right, center, or left of Israeli politics has, going back to 1994, and we talked about this, when the left was resurgent, and the left, in fact, was, for a short while, we got a little visitor here, was and many people thought this left-wing ascendancy would continue with the bus bombings of the mid-1990s, and then Rabin's death, etc. And then after the failure of Camp David, and certainly during the Intifada declines, and the right has ascended. So now 62% of Israelis see themselves as being with the right, and 35% of Israelis either see themselves as center or left. A lot to unpack there. Quite a few through lines from this election as well. And we'll quickly go through a few of them. One of the through lines is, of course, about the religious Zionist party, which recently won 14 seats in the Knesset. And of course, Itamar Ben-Gvir has most famously heads that party. Where'd they come from? And it's a fascinating story. And just to very quickly remind you of the story, because we've looked at this together, religious Zionists in many ways had been loyal to the Israeli government. They go back to the Mizrahi party all the way in 1900, are loyal to Herzl. We will be your religious wing, they say. They're writing prayers for the state of Israel. In 1948, the state of Israel, bless the state of Israel, the initial sprouting of our redemption, say the religious Zionists. 1967, though, in many ways, is you begin to see the departure for religious Zionists when they start to move into, after the Israeli army takes the West Bank, without the Israeli government, without the blessed Israeli state saying move in, they start moving ahead of the Israeli state and saying, Israeli state, you can either come with us or get left behind. And so this idea that religious Zionists were going to be loyal to the state starts to change a little bit in 1967. And now the religious Zionist party has moved into a position where they are now actively saying that we of Otzma Yehudit, who is that's Ben-Gvir's party of the religious Zionists, calls for Aliyah and building of the land. Well, that goes back in our through line for sure. The immigration of Jews coming into Israel, that certainly is a long-standing religious Zionist idea. And the emigration, the leaving of Israel by the enemies of the state of Israel, by the Arab populations, that many people say is yet another new development of the Israeli religious Zionist party. And so this is a really complicated new development, the 14 seats that they have acquired in the most recent government. So that's one through line that's worth thinking about from for this most recent election.
Yes, and I know we're over time, 2 minutes. I'm just going to say one sentence about each of the last slides, and then we'll close there. On your own, we encourage you, look at these 3 pictures. Where do you see a through line? Jabotinsky is iron wall and strength. Menachem Begin is support of a greater Israel, and Benjamin Netanyahu. All the same ideological stream. We invite you to think about that on your own. On the next slide. Is there a left center through line? Can you draw a line from David Ben-Gurion in the upper left to the Oslo Accords of Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin? Probably yes. Yair Lapid, the jury's still out. He's certainly spoken some of that language. It's one of those questions, if we were to come back, we could explore it together in the coming years. And then on the last slide, as all Americans in this group, how has the US relationship evolved over time? From Truman's recognition, to Jimmy Carter's trying to broker peace in the 70s with the Camp David Accord, to Bill Clinton and the 90s, to the Abraham Accords. What are the different ways in which the US is playing a role? So on the last slide, we'll leave you with, people always ask, what are the books, things we should read to learn more about? And we've given you 5 titles here. 4 books, City Upon a Hilltop, Interesting Settlements, Israel, A History, Anita Shapiro, a masterful overview, Like Dreamers we mentioned before, Catch Something we mentioned before, and a documentary film called The Human Factor, which is, I'll just say one word, it's really an amazing film, interviewing all the American negotiators from Bush's years through Clinton's years, all the way up to the present. most of whom are Jewish. Dennis Ross, Aaron David Miller, Martin Indyk, among others. And what's amazing about the story is they don't really talk about being peace negotiators, but what does it mean for their Jewish identity? And what an amazing film for all of you to watch and really understand the story and some of the pieces we talked about tonight, because I think that's what brings many of us here to this room, and I hope brought you to this course, is to think about what does Israel mean to each of you, your Jewish identity, your Jewish journey, your story. With that, really thank you for your indulgence for these last few minutes. Again, Yoni's going to share the slides. And we really, it was a privilege to be with you these past 4 sessions. We're delighted, both of us, to be resources. If these 4 books and documentary are not enough, believe us, we have plenty more on topics of interest to you to keep the learning going. So thank you for having us. Thank you, Jude. Thank you to those who made this these classes possible. It was a real privilege. So thank you.
Thank you both. I just wanted, before everybody hops off, I know we're running a few minutes over, but I want to thank you for joining us for the 4th and final session. Yoni and Jonathan, I did take a quick screenshot because I know everyone wants the resources. And I know there's many more that you mentioned in the other segments that I am excited to share, but really want to thank you for your knowledge and your expertise and for making this evening so, and the other sessions as well, so applicable and informative. So thank you again. I want to thank all of you for making the time in your schedules, because we're all busy people, but for showing up, it really matters. As GAN families, current, in the past, and in the future, God willing, there'll be many more of these. But most importantly, I think you know that this has been sponsored by a family who cares deeply about GAN and also about the Jewish people and about the state of Israel. So I want to encourage you to think about it as you think about your philanthropy and the opportunity for you to give generously to GAN. It's GAN's 25th anniversary. You will hear more about that. I promise I will not do a PSA now. But more importantly, if this is resonating with you, I really want you to think about how you can be helping to steward others along their Jewish journey and deepen their connections to Israel and to just really understand the complex world that we all live in. Having said that, I just also want to just thank Seth Finkel, who is not here this evening, who really helped coordinate and spearhead a lot of the Zoom links and everything else that really made tonight and the logistics possible. And after Thanksgiving, just not to be forgotten, I'm going to curate with Jonathan and Yoni and Seth a wonderful follow-up email that'll have all the links so you can go back and re-listen and share with your families who were not able to attend the recordings. And also there'll be information about upcoming exciting alumni events and current events at the school coming up very soon. And I really just want to thank you again. Seth, we'll be in touch together. And I just, on behalf of the entire team, wishing all of you a healthy and a happy Thanksgiving. And we look forward to seeing you in person very soon. Thank you so much.